Vesa Kolthari had never considered herself special in any way that mattered to the galaxy at large, and she was perfectly content with this fact as she sat alone in her small cabin aboard the commercial transport vessel called the Wandering Star, surrounded by sample containers filled with moss specimens from 17 different worlds. She was a xenobotanist, which meant she spent her days studying alien plants and fungi, while most other beings in the galaxy did far more. Exciting things like exploring uncharted systems or fighting in border conflicts or making vast fortunes in interstellar trade. Her life was quiet and predictable, and she liked it that way. The transport was 3 days out from the Theshan Collective, her home system, carrying a mixed cargo of passengers and freight through a relatively safe corridor of the outer spiral toward a research station where Vesa would spend the next 6 months cataloging new discoveries. She had just finished writing a message to her clutch siblings back home when the first explosion rocked the ship. The lights flickered and alarms began screaming through the corridors as Vesa tumbled from her chair and hit the floor hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. She scrambled to her feet and pressed herself against the wall, her two hearts pounding in her chest as she heard shouting and weapons fire somewhere in the distance. This could not be happening, she told herself over and over again. Pirates did not attack transports in this sector because the patrol routes were too regular and the risk was too high. But even as she repeated this logic in her mind, she could hear boots thundering down the corridor outside her cabin. The door exploded inward, and Vesa screamed as 3 massive figures stormed into her room. They were Vraxians, a species known throughout the galaxy for their brutality and their complete lack of anything resembling mercy or compassion. Their skin was thick and gray like stone, and their eyes glowed with a dull orange light that made them look like demons from the old stories Vesa's parents used to tell her when she was just a hatchling. The largest of them grabbed her by the arm and dragged her into the corridor before she could even think about resisting. She saw other passengers being herded along at gunpoint, their faces twisted with terror, and she realized with a sinking horror that this was not just a raid for cargo. These pirates were taking people. The Vraxians marched their captives through the damaged ship and into a docking tube that connected to a vessel that was all sharp angles and weapons platforms. A predator ship designed for exactly this kind of brutal work. Vesa counted maybe 20 prisoners in total, as they were shoved into a cargo hold that smelled of rust and fear and something else she did not want to identify. A Vraxian with a scarred face and one blind eye stepped forward and looked them over like a farmer inspecting livestock at market. This was Keth Morrow. Though Vesa did not know his name yet, she would learn it soon enough. Along with his reputation as one of the most ruthless slavers operating in the lawless territories beyond council space, Keth pointed at several of the prisoners, and his crew separated them from the group, dragging them away to destinations unknown. Then his fingers stopped on Vesa. She felt her blood turn to ice as he walked toward her, his boots echoing on the metal floor with each step. He grabbed her chin and turned her face from side to side, examining her like she was a piece of merchandise. And in that moment she understood that to him, that was exactly what she was. "This one goes in private holding," Keth said to his crew. And before Vesa could process what that meant, she was being dragged away from the other prisoners and down a narrow corridor to a cell that was barely large enough to stand in. The door slammed shut behind her, and she was alone in the darkness. She did not know why she had been separated from the others, and she did not know where they were taking her, and she did not know if anyone would ever come looking for a nobody xenobotanist who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. What Vesa did not know And what the Vraxians could not possibly have known was that her name had appeared on a very specific list 3 weeks ago. Someone had been compiling information about likely targets in this sector, tracking shipping routes and passenger manifests and security vulnerabilities with the kind of patience and precision that most beings in the galaxy could not comprehend. Someone had predicted that the Vraxians would hit this particular transport on this particular day, and someone had made very sure that Vesicolthury would be aboard. She was bait. Though she did not understand this yet, she was the key to finding something that had remained hidden for years. A secret location where the Syndicate conducted its most valuable transactions far from the eyes of law enforcement or military patrols, and the someone who had arranged all of this was currently sitting in a bar on a station 3 systems away, watching a tracker signal blink on a small device hidden in his palm. His name was Marcus Cole. 3 days ago, he had shared a drink with Vesa at a station bar because she looked lonely, and because she laughed at his terrible jokes, and because she reminded him, in some small way, of a girl he had lost long ago. He had helped her carry her sample cases to her ship, because that was the kind of thing a decent person would do. And while he helped her, he had slipped a microscopic tracker into the lining of one of those cases. He had not told her what he was really doing there. He had not told her that he had been hunting the Vraxians for 6 months. He had not told her that he needed them to lead him to the place they called the Maw, a hidden station where beings were bought and sold like cargo, and where the worst criminals in the galaxy gathered to conduct business that would make even hardened soldiers sick. Marcus finished his drink and stood up from the bar. The tracker was moving now, heading in exactly the direction he had predicted, and he allowed himself a small, cold smile that held no warmth whatsoever. He walked out of the bar and headed for the docking bay, where his ship was waiting. It was time to go to work. The Vraxian crew celebrated their successful raid in the mess hall of their ship, passing bottles of stolen liquor between them and laughing about how easy the whole thing had been. They had taken 23 prisoners in total, lost not a single crew member, and would reach the Maw in less than 2 standard days, where they would sell their cargo for enough credits to keep them drunk and happy for months. Keth Morrow sat at the head of the table with his boots up on the metal surface, a bottle in his hand and a satisfied grin on his scarred face. This was what he lived for, the thrill of the hunt and the reward that came after. And he saw no reason why this job should be any different from the hundreds he had completed before one of the younger pirates, a Vraxian named Tor, who had only been with the crew for a few months, leaned forward with a strange look on his face. "Captain, I heard something at the last port that has been bothering me," Tor said, his voice uncertain, like he was not sure if he should even be speaking. Keth raised an eyebrow and gestured for him to continue. "There was talk about a human," Tor said, and several of the older crew members immediately began to laugh. "A human?" One of them repeated with obvious amusement. "Oh no, we should all be very afraid of a soft little human who probably cries when he stubs his toe." The laughter grew louder, but Tor pressed on despite his embarrassment. "They call him the Revenant," he said, "and they say he hunts slavers like us, and they say he cannot be killed no matter how many times people try." Keth snorted and took a long drink from his bottle before responding. "Humans are weak creatures ruled by their emotions," he said with absolute confidence. "They form attachments to each other like parasites, and those attachments make them predictable and easy to manipulate. There is nothing special about them except their annoying tendency to breed on every world they touch." The crew laughed again and Tor fell silent. His question apparently answered to everyone's satisfaction, but at the far end of the table, an older Vraxian named Desik did not laugh. Desik had been in this business for 40 years, longer than most of the crew had been alive, and he had seen things that the younger pirates thought were just stories. He remembered a night 15 years ago when his syndicate's stronghold on his own homeworld had been attacked by a single intruder. The security footage had shown a human moving through the facility like a ghost, killing everyone who stood in his way with a calm efficiency that Desic still saw in his nightmares. 47 dead in less than an hour. And the human had walked out carrying a rescued hostage over his shoulder without a single scratch on his body. Desic had never spoken about what he saw that night because he knew no one would believe him. But he had never forgotten it either. He quietly pushed back from the table and excused himself, claiming he needed to check on some navigation calculations. What he actually did was make his way to the escape pod bay and verify that his personal pod was fully fueled and ready to launch at a moment's notice. If the stories about the Revenant were true, and if he was somehow connected to this particular job, Desic wanted to be ready to run back in the mess hall. Kath was still mocking the very idea that a human could be a threat to anyone. The only thing humans are good for is labor and entertainment, he declared to cheers from his crew, and occasionally as merchandise when the buyers want something exotic for their collections. The celebration continued late into the ship's night cycle, while the prisoners sat in darkness and fear in the cargo hold. Below, Vesicoltry had no idea what was happening above her. No idea that her captors were laughing and drinking while they carried her toward a fate worse than death. She sat in the corner of her tiny cell with her arms wrapped around her knees, trying not to think about what would happen when they reached their destination. She thought about her family and wondered if they would ever know what happened to her. She thought about her research and all the discoveries she would never make, and she thought about the human she had met at the station bar just 3 days ago. The one with the kind smile and the strange scars on his hands that he would not explain. His name was Marcus, she remembered, and he had laughed at her terrible jokes and helped her carry her cases even though she had not asked for help. She wondered what he was doing right now. Probably sitting in some other bar on some other station, completely unaware that the awkward xenobotanist he had been kind to was now in the hands of monsters. She had no way of knowing that Marcus Cole was not sitting in any bar. She had no way of knowing that his ship was currently following the Vraxian vessel at a distance carefully calculated to avoid detection. She had no way of knowing that the man she thought was just a friendly stranger was actually one of the most dangerous beings in the known galaxy. Marcus sat alone in the cockpit of his ship, which he called the Patient Hand, watching the tracker signal move across his display. He had not slept in 2 days, and he would not sleep for at least 2 more, because sleep was a luxury he could not afford when he was this close to his target. The human body could be pushed far beyond what most species believed possible, and Marcus had learned long ago how to exist in the spaces between exhaustion and collapse. He had learned many things in the years since his daughter was taken from him. He had learned how to track a ship across multiple star systems without being detected. He had learned how to infiltrate facilities that were supposed to be impenetrable. He had learned how to kill quickly and quietly and without hesitation. And he had learned that the galaxy was full of monsters who preyed on the innocent, and that someone had to hunt those monsters in return. A photograph was taped to his console, a young woman with his eyes and her mother's smile, and Marcus looked at it for a long moment before returning his attention to the navigation display. He would find them all, he would burn it to the ground, and he would save everyone he could, because that was the only thing that still gave his existence any meaning at all. The Vraxian ship dropped out of faster than light travel, and Marcus watched from a safe distance as it approached what appeared to be nothing more than a dead asteroid drifting in the void between stars. Then the asteroid began to open massive Doors slid apart to reveal a hollow interior filled with lights and docking platforms and more ships than Marcus had seen in one place since his days in the military. This was the Maw, the hidden auction station that had evaded law enforcement for over a decade. And Marcus felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest as he finally laid eyes on the place. He had been searching for since his daughter died. He did not approach the asteroid directly because that would have been suicide. Instead, he swung his ship wide around the system and looked for another way in. Some forgotten entrance or maintenance shaft that the Syndicate might have overlooked. It took him 4 hours of careful scanning before he found what he was looking for on the far side of the asteroid, hidden in shadow and marked as sealed on the old mining surveys he had obtained from his contacts. There was a shaft that led deep into the rock. Marcus guided the patient hand toward it with practiced skill, keeping his engines at minimum power to avoid detection. And when he reached the shaft entrance, he saw that it was indeed sealed with a heavy metal plate. He smiled without humor and began preparing his plasma charges while Marcus worked on his entry point. Vesa sat in her cell and tried to stay calm as the ship shuddered with the vibrations of docking. She heard doors opening and boots marching and orders being shouted in languages she did not understand. Then her own cell door slid open and 2 Raxian guards grabbed her arms and dragged her out into a corridor filled with other prisoners, all of them looking just as terrified as she felt. They were marched through a docking tube and into the asteroid station, and Vesa's heart sank as she saw the scale of the operation around her. This was not some small pirate hideout, but a fully functioning facility with hundreds of beings moving through its corridors. Buyers and sellers and guards and workers, all going about their business as if the trafficking of living beings was just another form of commerce. The prisoners were separated into groups, and Vesa found herself pushed into a holding cell with a dozen other beings from various species, none of whom she recognized. They huddled together in fear and whispered to each other in the darkness, sharing stories of how they had been taken and wondering what would happen to them. Next, Vesa did not speak because she had nothing useful to say. She simply sat and waited and tried not to think about the future back on his ship. Marcus opened a secure communication channel to the only person in the galaxy he still trusted. Her name was Syl, and she was a Rithian information broker who operated from a hidden station somewhere in the neutral territories. She owed Marcus her life twice over, and she always paid her debts. "I need everything you have on the Maw," Marcus said without greeting or small talk. "Layout, guard rotations, ventilation systems, power grid, emergency protocols, everything." There was a pause on the other end of the channel before Syl responded. "Marcus, that station has over 200 armed personnel and some of the best security systems money can buy," she said with obvious concern in her voice. "You cannot assault it alone." "I'm not going to assault it," Marcus replied. "Then what are you going to do?" Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked at the photograph of his daughter taped to his console. "I am going to dismantle it piece by piece until there is nothing left but rubble and regret." Syl was silent for a long moment before she spoke again. "I will send you everything I have. But Marcus, please be careful. The galaxy still needs people like you." Marcus ended the communication without responding to her concern, because he did not know how to explain that he had stopped caring about his own survival a long time ago. All that mattered now was the mission. The data package from Syl arrived within the hour, and Marcus spent the next several hours memorizing every detail of the station's layout. He identified 17 structural weak points were carefully placed. Charges could cause maximum damage. He mapped the patrol routes of the guards and found the gaps in their coverage that he could exploit. He located the holding cells where the prisoners were kept and planned his route to reach them without being detected. And he prepared his weapons with the kind of care and attention that only came from years of practice. His armor was matte black and designed to absorb light and scatter thermal signatures so that he would be nearly invisible in the shadows. His rifle was silenced and accurate at ranges that would have seemed impossible to most shooters. His sidearm was simple and reliable, and had never failed him in over a decade of use, and he carried a knife that he had taken from a slaver he killed on his very first hunt, a trophy that reminded him why he did this work when he was ready. Marcus sealed his armor and made his way to the airlock. The plasma charges had done their work, and the sealed shaft was now open, a dark tunnel leading into the heart of the asteroid. Marcus stepped into the darkness without hesitation. He had a promise to keep. Not to Vesa, or to the other prisoners, or even to himself, but to a ghost who still visited his dreams every night. He had promised his daughter that he would make them pay, every single one of them, and Marcus Cole always kept his promises. Marcus moved through the abandoned mining tunnels like a shadow given form, his footsteps making no sound on the ancient stone as he approached the heart of the maw. The tunnels were dark and forgotten, exactly as he had hoped, and he encountered no resistance as he made his way deeper into the asteroid. After nearly an hour of careful navigation, he reached a ventilation shaft that connected to the main station, and he paused to check his equipment one final time before beginning the next phase of his plan. He placed the first explosive charge on a structural support beam and armed it with a timer that would give him exactly 45 minutes to complete his mission. Then he moved on and placed another charge and another and another, each one carefully positioned to cause maximum structural damage when they detonated. By the time he reached the main corridors of the station, he had placed 12 charges at critical points throughout the facility. The maw was now a bomb waiting to explode, and nobody except Marcus knew it. He emerged from a maintenance hatch into a dimly lit corridor and immediately pressed himself against the wall as a patrol passed by just 20 meters away. The guards were Vraxians, 2 of them walking with the casual confidence of beings who had never faced a real threat in their lives. They did not notice the shadow that detached itself from the darkness behind them. The first guard died without making a sound, a sharp pressure at the base of his skull dropping him to the ground in an instant. The second guard had just enough time to turn and see something moving toward him before the knife found his throat and silenced him forever. Marcus dragged both bodies into a storage closet and continued on his way. He moved through the station like death itself, avoiding the main corridors where he could and eliminating any guards who crossed his path when he could not. Each kill was quick and quiet and efficient, the work of a predator who had perfected his craft over years of relentless practice. By the time he reached the holding cells on level 7, he had left 17 bodies in his wake, and not a single alarm had been raised. The holding cells were guarded by 4 Vraxians with heavy weapons, too many to take down silently without risking detection. Marcus studied the situation for a moment and then made his decision. He pulled a small device from his belt and tossed it down the corridor, where it rolled to a stop a few meters from the guards and began emitting a high-pitched whine. The guards looked at the device in confusion for just a second too long. The flash grenade detonated and filled the corridor with blinding light, and Marcus was among them before they could recover. 4 seconds later, he was the only one standing. He moved to the cell doors and began checking each one, calling out in a calm voice that seemed completely out of place in this house of horrors. "If you can hear me, stay calm and stay quiet. I am here to get you out." He found Vesa in the 3rd cell he checked. She was huddled in the corner with her arms wrapped around her knees, and when the door opened, she looked up with terror in her eyes, expecting another monster come to drag her away. But instead she saw a human in black armor, his face hidden behind a helmet, and something about the way he stood made her freeze. He knelt down and removed his helmet, and Vesa gasped as she recognized the face beneath. It was Marcus, the kind stranger from the bar. But he was not the same person she remembered. His eyes were cold and hard like chips of ice, and there was a darkness in his expression that made her instinctively want to shrink away. But when he spoke, his voice was soft and gentle, the voice of the man who had laughed at her jokes and helped her carry her cases. "Vesa, do you remember me?" She nodded, unable to find her voice. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that for me?" She nodded again. Marcus reached into his belt and pulled out a small device that fit easily in the palm of his hand. "When I tell you, press the button on this device. It will guide you to the hangar where there is a ship waiting for you. Silver hull with no markings. Get inside and seal the door, and do not come out until I come for you. Do you understand? What about you?" Vesa managed to whisper. Marcus stood up and put his helmet back on. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost all its gentleness. "I have unfinished business." He moved to the other cells and released the prisoners inside, giving each of them quick instructions on how to reach the hangar. They were too scared and confused to argue, and within minutes, they were all moving as a group toward the docking area, while Marcus headed in the opposite direction, toward the auction hall, toward Kethmaro, toward the reckoning that had been building for 9 years. The device in Vesa's hand began to beep, and she pressed the button as Marcus had instructed. A holographic arrow appeared in front of her, pointing the way to safety, and she followed it without looking back. Behind her, she heard the first sounds of weapons fire as Marcus announced his presence to the rest of the station in the most direct way possible. The devil had walked into the mall, and now the devils who ran it were about to learn what fear really meant. The auction was in full swing when the lights went out. For 3 long seconds, the grand hall was plunged into complete darkness, and the only sounds were the confused murmurs of buyers and sellers who had never experienced anything like this before. Then the emergency lights flickered on, painting everything in a deep red glow that made the hall look like something from a nightmare. And then the screaming started. Marcus came through the main entrance like a force of nature, his rifle firing in precise controlled bursts that dropped guards. Before they could even raise their weapons, the buyers scattered in panic, abandoning their seats and fleeing for the exits. And Marcus let them go because they were not his primary target tonight. Let them run, he thought. Let them spread the word about what happens when you traffic in living beings. He moved through the chaos with a calm efficiency that terrified everyone who witnessed it. Every shot finding its mark, every movement calculated to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. The guards tried to organize a response, but they were used to dealing with scared prisoners and desperate captives, not a predator who had been hunting their kind for nearly a decade. Marcus cut through them like a hot knife through soft butter. He reached the center of the auction hall, where a raised platform still held the beings who had been on display when the attack began, and he shouted for them to run for the hangars while covering their escape with deadly accurate fire. Then he turned his attention to the security office at the far end of the hall, where his sensors told him Kethmaro had retreated, along with his most loyal fighters. The Vraxian captain had barricaded himself behind reinforced doors with a dozen of his best soldiers, and they had set up defensive positions with heavy weapons covering every approach. Under normal circumstances, this would have been an impregnable position, but Marcus Cole was not normal circumstances. He studied the layout for exactly 3 seconds and then began his assault. He used the environment as a weapon, triggering a power surge in one corridor that electrocuted 2 guards who were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He caused an explosive decompression in another section by shooting out a weakened wall panel, sucking 3 more guards into the vacuum before emergency bulkheads sealed the breach. He activated the fire suppression system in the main approach, filling the corridor with thick foam that blinded the guards long enough for him to close the distance and engage them at point blank range. One by one, the defenders fell, and one by one Marcus moved closer to his target. The last two guards tried to surrender when they realized they were the only ones left between Marcus and their captain. He shot them anyway, because he had learned long ago that slavers did not deserve mercy. Then he planted a breaching charge on the reinforced door and stepped back. The explosion tore the door from its frame, and Marcus walked through the smoke and fire. Like a demon emerging from hell itself, Kethmaro stood alone at the back of the office, his weapon raised but his hands shaking with fear. He fired at Marcus, but the shots went wide, his aim ruined by terror. And then his gun clicked empty, and he had nothing left but desperation. "What are you?" Keth whispered as Marcus approached, his voice barely audible over the alarms blaring throughout the station. Marcus stopped a meter away from the slaver and looked at him for a long moment. He saw the cruelty in those glowing orange eyes, the greed, the absolute certainty that the galaxy was his to exploit and abuse as he pleased. He saw a monster who had destroyed countless lives without ever feeling a moment of guilt or regret, and he saw the face of every slaver he had hunted over the past 9 years. Because in the end they were all the same. "I am the consequence," Marcus said. The shot echoed through the station. Kethmaro fell to the ground and did not move again. Marcus stood over the body for a moment and then checked his timer. He had 4 minutes before the charges detonated. He turned and ran for the hangar bay, moving faster than any human should be able to move. And he reached his ship just as the first explosions began to tear through the station. Vesa was inside the cockpit as he had instructed, strapped into the co-pilot's seat with a thermal blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and he could see that she had been crying. Marcus did not say anything as he slid into the pilot's seat and powered up the engines. He guided the ship out of the collapsing hangar and into busy open space just as a massive explosion ripped through the heart of the maw. The asteroid shuddered and cracked and then began to fall apart. Billions of tons of rock and metal and everything inside it consumed by fire and fury. Marcus watched the destruction for a long moment and then turned the ship away and engaged the faster-than-light drive. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour before Vesa finally found the courage to speak. "Why?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Why did you save me? You do not even know me." Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph that had been taped to his console, the one of the young woman with his eyes and her mother's smile. "I could not save her," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of grief that Vesa could not begin to comprehend. "But I can save others, everyone I can, for as long as I can." Vesa looked at the photograph and understood. Without needing to ask, she understood why a human had become a legend. She understood why the slavers feared a species they thought was soft and weak. She understood that human emotion was not a weakness at all, but a strength beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus tucked the photograph away and set a course for the Deshan Collective. "Now I take you home. And then I find the next one. The next one. There is always another slaver, another victim, another fight. The darkness never really ends. But that does not mean we stop fighting against it." Vesa nodded slowly and looked out at the stars streaming past the viewport. She had been kidnapped by monsters and rescued by a legend, and she knew that her life would never be the same after this night. But she also knew that somewhere out there, other beings were trapped in darkness, just as she had been. And somewhere out there, Marcus Cole would find them because that was what humans did. They endured when other species would have given up. They remembered when others would have forgotten. They hunted when others would have hidden, and they never, ever stopped. The ship jumped to light speed and carried them toward home, leaving behind the burning wreckage of the maw and the broken bodies of those who had thought they could prey on the innocent without consequence. The galaxy was vast and dark and full of monsters. But now those monsters knew that something was hunting them in return, and his name was Marcus Cole the Revenant, the human who would not die. The legend that slavers everywhere would learn to fear, and somewhere in the black between stars, in a small ship carrying a xenobotanist home to her family, a tired soldier allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment. He had kept his promise, and tomorrow he would make another one, because the fight was never over. But as long as there were humans in the galaxy, the darkness would never win.